Tonight, we travel to Wethersfield, Connecticut, in the winter of 1782, where a merchant's household stood dark and still on the banks of the great river. Before the year was out, a tragedy would be discovered here that would trouble the young nation's conscience for generations. This is the story of William Beadle, his wife Lydia, and their 4 children, and the question of what drove a seemingly respectable man to destroy everything he held dear. Good evening and welcome. You have found your way to a place of calm. There will be no sudden sounds here, no raised voices, nothing to startle you from rest. If you find comfort in these stories and wish to follow us, we shall always have a tale waiting for you. The night is yours, and so is this story. Good evening and welcome. The Connecticut River moves slowly through the heart of New England, broad and patient, carrying with it the memory of centuries. In the late 18th century, its waters bore the commerce of a young republic, timber and grain, livestock and cloth, the produce of farms and the goods of merchants who had staked their fortunes on the promise of a new world. Along its western bank, where the land rises gently from the floodplain, the town of Wethersfield had grown old and comfortable, its roots reaching back more than 150 years to the earliest days of English settlement. Wethersfield was, by 1782, a place of quiet distinction. Its streets were lined with houses of weathered clapboard and sturdy brick, their chimneys rising against the grey winter sky. The meeting house stood at the centre of town, its white steeple visible for miles across the flat fields that surrounded it. Here, families gathered on Sundays to hear sermons that spoke of providence and duty, of the trials that tested the faithful and the rewards that awaited the righteous. The rhythms of life were dictated by the seasons, planting and harvest, the freezing of the river and its thaw, the slow turning of the year. The town had prospered in the decades before the war. Its fields produced onions and flax, its craftsmen turned out barrels and shoes, and its merchants sent their goods downriver to the ports of the coast. The houses of the leading families were furnished with Windsor chairs and sturdy tables, with pewter and earthenware, with the modest comforts of a people who valued industry and frugality above all else. There was wealth here, but it was not ostentatious. It was the wealth of careful accumulation, of generations who had worked the same land and traded in the same markets. Yet by the winter of 1782, the old certainties had begun to fray. The war for independence, now drawing to its close, had brought not only victory but also upheaval. The Continental Congress, desperate to finance the struggle against Britain, had printed money in vast quantities, and that money had lost its value almost as quickly as it was issued. A merchant who accepted continental currency at face value might find, within months, that his payment was worth a fraction of what it had been. Prices rose and fell unpredictably. Debts that had seemed manageable became crushing burdens. The careful calculations of a lifetime could be undone in a single season. In Wethersfield, as in towns throughout New England, the effects of this turmoil were felt in every household. Farmers who had sold their crops for paper money found themselves unable to buy seed for the next planting. Shopkeepers who had extended credit to their neighbors discovered that they could not collect what they were owed. The bonds of trust that had held the community together were strained by suspicion and resentment. Some men found ways to prosper even in these uncertain times, raising their prices to keep pace with inflation or quietly refusing to accept the worthless pay. Others, bound by conscience or by law, accepted what was offered and watched their fortunes dwindle. It was into this world of quiet anxiety that the Beadle family had settled nearly a decade before. William Beadle had arrived in Wethersfield in April of 1773, bringing with him his wife Lydia and their young son Ansel. He was a merchant by trade, a man who had operated several successful businesses in other New England towns before seeking new opportunities along the river. He was not a native of Connecticut, but he had made himself at home among its people, establishing himself as a man of substance and respectability. In the years that followed, 3 more children were born, daughters named Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary. The family grew, and with it, the household's modest prosperity. The Beadle home was a merchant's dwelling, comfortable but not grand. It had rooms enough for a family of 6, with space for a maid who lived or worked within the household. There was a study where William Beadle kept his accounts and conducted his business, furnished with a Windsor chair and a plain table. The children slept in their own quarters, and the rhythms of domestic life unfolded according to the customs of the time. Meals prepared and served, fires tended, linens washed, the endless round of tasks that kept a household running. From the outside, it was a home like any other in Wethersfield, unremarkable in its appearance, indistinguishable from the houses of its neighbors. Yet within those walls, something was quietly unraveling. The same forces that had disrupted the town's economy had struck at the heart of William Beadle's fortune. He had been, by all accounts, a patriotic man. When the port of Boston had been closed by Parliament in the years before the war, he had contributed to the relief of its suffering citizens, a gesture that marked him as a supporter of the American cause. When the Continental Congress had declared that its paper currency must be accepted at face value, Beadle had obeyed. He had not raised his prices to offset the depreciation. He had not quietly turned away customers who offered him worthless notes. He had done what the law required and what his conscience demanded, and for this he had been ruined. The details of his decline are not fully recorded, but the outlines are clear enough. Year by year, the value of his holdings had eroded. The goods he sold brought less and less in return. The debts owed to him became uncollectible. The savings he had accumulated over a lifetime of careful work melted away like snow in spring. By the early 1780s, William Beadle was no longer a man of means. He was a man on the edge of poverty, watching as his neighbors, many of whom had ignored the same rules he had followed, continued to prosper. For a man of Beadle's temperament, this reversal was more than a financial setback. It was a wound to his pride, a challenge to his sense of who he was and what he deserved. He had always believed himself to be, in his own words, above the common mold. He had lived well, and he had meant well. The thought of descending into dependence, of becoming an object of charity or pity, was intolerable to him. He could not imagine a future in which he was not the master of his own household, the provider for his family, the respected figure he had always been. And so, in the quiet of his study, William Beadle began to contemplate a terrible solution. The mystery of what happened in that house on the 11th of December 1782 is not a mystery of identity or motive. We know who was responsible, and we know in broad terms why. The mystery lies deeper, in the workings of a mind that could persuade itself that destruction was preferable to disgrace, that the lives of a wife and 4 children could be weighed against the fear of poverty and found wanting. It is a mystery that the people of Wethersfield would struggle to understand, and one that would haunt the memory of the town for generations to come. The river flowed on, as it always had. The fields lay fallow under the winter sky. And in a house on the edge of town, a family slept, unaware that their story was about to become a warning for an age. The world that William Beadle inhabited was shaped by forces larger than any single household, yet those forces made themselves felt in the most intimate details of daily life. To understand what happened in Wethersfield, it is necessary to understand the society in which the Beadle family lived, its hierarchies and expectations, its rhythms and routines, its unspoken rules about success and failure, honor and shame. Connecticut in the 1780s was a place of small towns and scattered farms, of close-knit communities bound together by ties of kinship, religion, and commerce. The population was overwhelmingly English in origin, Protestant in faith, and agrarian in occupation. Most families worked the land, raising crops and livestock for their own use and for sale in local markets. The merchant class to which William Beadle belonged occupied a position of some distinction. They were the men who connected the countryside to the wider world, who who brought in goods from distant ports and sent out the produce of the region in return. To be a merchant in this society was to be something more than a shopkeeper. It was to be a man of affairs, trusted with credit and contracts, responsible for the flow of goods and money that kept the community functioning. A successful merchant was expected to be prudent and industrious, honest in his dealings and reliable in his obligations. He was expected to maintain a household that reflected his standing, comfortable but not extravagant, staffed by servants or hired help, furnished with the modest luxuries that marked a family as respectable. His wife and children were expected to dress neatly, to attend meeting on Sundays, to behave in ways that brought credit to the family name. The social hierarchy of a Connecticut town was not rigid, but it was real. At the top were the ministers and magistrates, the men of learning and authority who guided the community's spiritual and civic life. Below them were the prosperous farmers and merchants, the men who owned land and stock, who employed servants and apprentices, who contributed to the support of the church and the maintenance of the roads. Below them in turn were the smaller farmers and tradesmen, the laborers and journeymen, the widows and orphans who depended on the charity of their neighbors. At the very bottom were the poor, the transient, the disreputable, those who had failed to find a secure place in the community and who lived on its margins, objects of suspicion and pity. For a man like William Beadle, the prospect of descending from the middle ranks to the bottom was not merely a matter of material hardship. It was a matter of identity, of self-respect, of everything that made life meaningful. To lose one's fortune was to lose one's place in the world, to become invisible or worse, an object of contempt. The same neighbors who had once greeted you with respect would now look through you or worse, offer you their charity with a mixture of condescension and relief that they had not shared your fate. The economic disruptions of the Revolutionary era made such descents all too common. The war had created opportunities for some and disasters for others. Merchants who had speculated wisely, or who had found ways to evade the legal tender laws, emerged from the conflict with their fortunes intact or even enhanced. Those who had played by the rules, who had accepted the depreciating currency and honored their obligations, often found themselves ruined. The injustice of this outcome was felt keenly by those who suffered. They had done what was asked of them, and they had been punished for it. William Beadle was not alone in his bitterness. Throughout New England, men who had lost their savings to the currency collapse nursed grievances against the system that had betrayed them. Some turned to politics, agitating for debt relief or currency reform. Others turned to drink or to despair, or to the slow, grinding poverty that awaited those who could not recover their losses. A few, like Beadle, turned inward, brooding on their misfortunes and searching for some way to escape the fate that awaited them. The daily rhythms of life in Wethersfield continued, indifferent to the anxieties of any single household. The town woke with the sun and retired with its setting. Farmers tended their animals and mended their fences. Craftsmen worked at their trades. Women cooked and cleaned and spun, managing the endless labor of the household. Children attended school or helped with chores, learning the skills they would need to take their places in the adult world. On Sundays, the community gathered for worship, listening to sermons that reminded them of their duties to God and to one another. Religion was the bedrock of this society, the framework within which all other concerns were understood. The Congregational churches of Connecticut taught a stern but hopeful faith, that human beings were sinners, prone to error and temptation, but that through grace and repentance they could find salvation. The ministers who preached from the pulpits of Wethersfield and its neighboring towns were men of considerable learning and influence, respected for their piety and their knowledge of Scripture. They counseled their flocks to accept the trials of life with patience, to trust in the providence of God, and to look forward to the rewards of the life to come. Not everyone accepted this teaching without question. The 18th century had seen the rise of new ideas about religion and morality, ideas that challenged the authority of the established churches and offered alternative ways of understanding the world. Deism, as this movement was sometimes called, held that God had created the universe but did not intervene in its workings, that human beings were capable of discovering moral truth through reason rather than revelation, and that the doctrines of traditional Christianity were superstitions to be discarded. These ideas had spread widely among the educated classes of Europe and America, and they had found adherents even in the small towns of New England. William Beadle, according to the accounts that survive, was drawn to such ideas. He read widely and thought deeply about questions of fate and providence, of the rights of the individual and the nature of the soul. He came to believe, or so his later writings suggest, that human beings had the right to dispose of their own lives as they saw fit, that suicide was not a sin, but a rational choice in the face of unbearable circumstances. These views set him apart from his neighbors, who regarded such beliefs as dangerous and heretical. They would later be cited as evidence of the moral corruption that had led him to his terrible act. But in the years before the tragedy, Beadle kept his beliefs largely to himself. He attended meeting, fulfilled his obligations, maintained the outward appearance of a respectable citizen. His neighbors knew him as a man of business, perhaps a little reserved, perhaps a little proud, but not as a man to be feared or shunned. The tensions within his household, the anxieties that gnawed at him in the quiet hours of the night, were hidden from view. The mask of respectability remained in place, even as the man behind it was slowly coming apart. The Beadle household, in its daily routines, would have resembled countless others in Wethersfield. The maid rose early to light the fires and prepare the morning meal. The children were dressed and fed, sent off to their lessons or their chores. Lydia Beadle managed the domestic economy, overseeing the work of the household and tending to the needs of her family. William Beadle attended to his business, such as it was, and retreated to his study to brood over his accounts and his grievances. Meals were taken together, prayers were said, the rituals of family life were observed. Yet beneath this surface of normalcy, something was wrong. Beadle had been planning in secret for years. He had acquired the tools he would need: an axe, a carving knife, a pair of pistols. He had written out his reasons, setting down on paper the arguments that justified in his own mind the destruction of his family. He had chosen dates, then postponed them, waiting for the right moment. The mystery of his intentions remained hidden, even from those who shared his roof. And so the days passed, one after another, as the winter deepened and the year drew to its close. The people of Wethersfield went about their business, unaware of the shadow that had fallen over one of their households. The river flowed on, carrying its burden of ice and memory. And in a house on the edge of town, a man sat alone with his thoughts, waiting for the moment when he would act. Lydia Beadle was a wife and mother in an age when those roles defined a woman's life almost entirely. The records that survive tell us little about her as an individual, her hopes, her fears, her private thoughts. We know that she married William Beadle and bore him 4 children. We know that she managed his household, oversaw the work of the maid, and fulfilled the duties expected of a merchant's wife in late 18th century Connecticut. We know that she was away from home in the weeks before her death and that she returned earlier than her husband had expected. Beyond these bare facts, she remains a figure glimpsed only in outline, her voice lost to history. What we can say with some confidence is that Lydia Beadle's world was circumscribed by the walls of her home and the expectations of her community. A woman of her station was expected to be industrious and pious, obedient to her husband and attentive to her children. She was expected to keep the household running smoothly, to stretch the family's resources as far as they would go, to maintain the appearance of respectability even in times of hardship. If she had worries about her husband's state of mind or the family's finances, she would have had few outlets for expressing them and fewer still for acting on them. The children, too, are known to us only in fragments. Ansel, the eldest, was about 11 years old at the time of the tragedy. He had been born before the family's move to Wethersfield and had grown up in the shadow of his father's ambitions and anxieties. Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary were younger, the last of them only about 6. They would have attended to their lessons and their chores, played in the yard or by the fire, quarreled and made up as children do. They would have known their father as a distant figure, perhaps preoccupied with his business and his thoughts, but also as the head of the household, the source of authority and in better times of security. We do not know what the children understood of their father's troubles. They may have sensed the tension in the house, the silences that fell at the dinner table, the worried glances exchanged between their parents, or they may have been shielded from the worst of it, their days filled with the ordinary concerns of childhood. The sources do not tell us, and we are left to imagine their lives as best we can. William Beadle himself is a more fully documented figure, though the picture that emerges is far from complete. He was about 52 years old at the time of his death, a man who had spent his adult life in trade and commerce. He had moved from place to place in search of opportunity, settling at last in Wethersfield with the hope of building a secure future for his family. He was proud, perhaps excessively so, and he had a strong sense of his own worth. He believed himself to be, as he put it, above the common mold, a man who had lived well and meant well. This pride, which might in other circumstances have been a source of strength, became in Beadle's case a fatal weakness. He could not accept the reversal of his fortunes. He could not imagine himself as a poor man, dependent on the charity of others, stripped of the status he had worked so hard to achieve. The thought of such a future filled him with dread and eventually with a cold determination to avoid it at any cost. Beadle's writings, which survived him and were widely circulated after his death, offer a window into his mind. He set down his beliefs about fate and providence, about the rights of the individual and the nature of the soul. He argued that a man had the right to end his own life when circumstances made it unbearable, and that a father had the right, even the duty, to spare his children the sufferings that awaited them. These arguments were framed in the language of reason and philosophy, drawing on ideas that had circulated among the educated classes of the age. But they were also the arguments of a man who had lost his way, who had convinced himself that destruction was preferable to disgrace. The household also included a maid, whose name does not appear in the sources consulted here. She was a servant, employed to help with the work of the house, and she lived or worked closely enough to the family that she was present on the night before the tragedy. Her position in the household was one of dependence and subordination. She answered to her employers, performed the tasks assigned to her, and had little say in the affairs of the family. Yet it was she who would be sent out on the morning of the 11th of December, dispatched on an errand that would take her away from the house at the crucial moment. The family physician, Dr. Joseph Farnsworth, was another figure in the Beadle's world. He was the man to whom Lydia Beadle would have turned in times of illness, the man whose advice and ministrations were trusted by the household. On the morning of the tragedy, it was to Dr. Farnsworth that the maid was sent, on the pretext that Mrs. Beadle had been unwell during the night. This errand, innocent in appearance, was part of Beadle's plan to ensure that the house would be empty of witnesses when he acted. To speak of these people, to name them and describe their circumstances, is to acknowledge the limits of what we can know. The records that survive are fragmentary, filtered through the judgments of those who wrote them down. The voices of Lydia and the children are silent. We hear only what others said about them, and even that is sparse. The dignity we owe them is the dignity of recognition. They were real people with lives and hopes of their own, caught up in a tragedy they did not choose and could not escape. The Beadle household in the weeks before the tragedy would have appeared to outsiders as unremarkable. The family went about its business, the maid performed her duties, the children played and quarreled and slept. If there were signs of what was to come, they were not recorded or not recognized for what they were. The mask of normalcy held, even as the man behind it was preparing to shatter it forever. And so the days passed, one after another, as the winter deepened and the year drew to its close. The people of Wethersfield went about their lives, unaware of the shadow that had fallen over one of their households. The river flowed on, patient and indifferent, and in a house on the edge of town, a family waited, unknowing, for the moment when their story would become a mystery that would trouble the conscience of a nation. Rest well. A peaceful night to you. The morning began, as mornings did, with small necessities. In the Beadle household, the maid would have risen first, stirring the fire back to life, coaxing warmth from embers that had cooled through the long December night. The children slept on in their beds. Lydia perhaps lay awake already, listening to the familiar sounds of a house coming to life around her. This was the rhythm of survival in Wethersfield in the winter of 1782. Each day demanded its small labors. Wood must be carried, water must be drawn, bread must be baked, and candles must be lit against the early darkness that came so quickly in those short days. The people of the town moved through these tasks without thinking, their hands knowing the work even when their minds wandered elsewhere. William Beadle had once been a man of consequence. He had arrived in Wethersfield from Fairfield in April of 1773, bringing with him his wife Lydia and their young son Ansel. He came as a merchant, a man of trade and ambition, and for a time the town received him as such. He had capital, he had connections, he had, it seemed, a future. The Beadle house stood as a testament to that earlier prosperity. It was a merchant's home, comfortable without being grand, with rooms enough for a growing family and space for a maid to sleep under the same roof. There was a study where William kept his papers and conducted his business. There were beds for the children, 4 of them now. Ansel, the eldest at about 11 years of age, and his 3 sisters, Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary. The youngest, Mary, was only 6. Inside such a house, the day had its own architecture. The maid moved through the lower rooms, attending to her duties. The children would wake and dress and take their breakfast. Lydia would oversee the household, managing the small economy of domestic life, the stores of flour and salt, the mending that needed doing, the countless decisions that kept a family fed and clothed and warm. William, in those earlier years, would have gone out to his business. A merchant's day was spent in negotiation and calculation, in the weighing of goods and the counting of coin. He bought and sold. He extended credit and collected debts. He was part of a web of commerce that stretched from Wethersfield to Hartford, to New Haven, to Boston and beyond. But by December of 1782, that web had frayed almost to nothing. The trouble had begun years before, when the Continental Congress had begun printing paper money to finance the war against Britain. The new currency was meant to be a promise, a note of faith in the revolutionary cause. But promises, when multiplied too freely, lose their weight. The paper dollars depreciated. What had once bought a barrel of flour came to buy only half a barrel, then a quarter, then less. Connecticut, like other states, passed laws requiring merchants to accept this paper money at its face value. A patriot, the reasoning went, would not refuse the currency of his own nation. A patriot would trust that victory would restore the money's worth. William Beadle was, by all accounts, a patriot. When the port of Boston had been closed by Parliament years earlier, he had contributed to the relief of its citizens. He believed in the cause. And so, when the law required him to accept continental dollars at face value, he obeyed. He took the paper money. He gave out goods in return. He watched his fortune drain away. Other merchants were not so scrupulous. Many found ways around the regulations, raising their prices to match the currency's decline, or simply refusing to sell for paper at all. They preserved their wealth while men like Beadle, who followed the letter of the law, saw theirs evaporate. There was a bitter irony in this. The honest man was ruined. The clever man survived. By the winter of 1782, William Beadle was no longer among the prosperous merchants of Wethersfield. He had been a man of more wealth than most, and now he was something else. The change gnawed at him. He had lived well, he had meant well. And yet here he was, facing a future of dependency and diminishment. Inside the house, the family went on with their lives. The children grew. Lydia managed the household with whatever resources remained. The maid continued her work. From the outside, the Beadle home might have looked much as it always had. The same windows, the same door, the same smoke rising from the chimney on cold mornings. But William Beadle was keeping secrets. In his study, he had begun to write. Not letters of business, but something else. Pages filled with his thoughts on fate, on fortune, on the nature of life and death. He had read widely, it seems, in the philosophy of the age. He had encountered ideas that set him apart from the orthodox faith of his neighbors. He believed in a God, but not the God of the congregational meeting house. He believed in reason, in a universe governed by natural law rather than miraculous intervention. These beliefs in another man might have remained a private matter, but in William Beadle they had become entangled with his despair. He had come to believe that a man had the right to end his own life. More than that, he had come to believe that a father had the right, perhaps even the duty, to spare his children from a future of poverty and shame. He had been thinking these thoughts for years. 3 years by some accounts. He had been planning in the quiet hours what he would do when the moment came. The family knew nothing of this. Lydia went about her days, caring for her children, managing her household, perhaps worrying about money as any wife might worry when times were hard. The children played and quarreled and grew. Ansel was nearly a young man now. The girls were still young, still innocent of the world's cruelties. And the maid, whose name has not come down to us, slept in her place and did her work and saw nothing that alarmed her. This was the fragile fabric of daily life in the Beadle house. Partners who shared a bed and a table, who had built a life together over years of marriage. Siblings who knew each other's habits and voices, who had never lived apart. A servant who depended on her employers for her place in the world. A physician, Dr. Joseph Farnsworth, who attended the family when illness came, as illness always did in those days of uncertain medicine. These were the connections that linked one person to another. They were ordinary connections, the kind that exist in any household, in any town, in any age. They were also, in their way, terribly fragile. They depended on trust. They depended on the assumption that tomorrow would be much like today, that the people you loved would still be there when you woke. In Wethersfield, the river flowed on toward the sea. The days grew shorter as December advanced. The war was winding toward its end, though no one could say exactly when peace would come or what it would bring. People went to meeting on Sundays and heard sermons about providence and duty. They visited their neighbors and spoke of the weather and the harvest and the news from distant places. And in a house on the edge of town, a man sat in his study with his papers, thinking thoughts that no one else could see. The mystery that would later trouble the conscience of a nation was already taking shape, hidden behind the ordinary rhythms of a winter's day. The last ordinary evening came and went without ceremony. On the night of the 10th of December, 1782, the Beadle family was at home. The maid was present. The children were in their beds. Lydia, the wife and mother, was in the house she had shared with William for nearly a decade. Nothing in the surviving records suggests that this night was different from any other. The fire would have been banked. The candles would have been snuffed. The house would have settled into the particular silence of a winter's night, when the cold presses in and the darkness seems very close. Lydia had been away from home recently. She had returned about 10 days earlier than her husband had expected. This detail, small as it seems, would later take on a grim significance. William Beadle had marked a date in his mind, the 18th of November, as the time when he would act. But Lydia's early return had disrupted his plans. He had waited. He had postponed. He had continued to live alongside his family, eating at their table, sleeping in their house, while the secret purpose grew heavier inside him. Now on the night of the 10th, he waited again. At some point in the early hours of the 11th of December, William Beadle rose. The house was dark. The family slept. He went to the maid and woke her. He told her that Mrs. Beadle had been ill all night. He instructed her to go and fetch Dr. Joseph Farnsworth, the family physician. The maid did as she was told. She dressed and went out into the cold December morning, making her way through the streets of Wethersfield to the doctor's house. She had no reason to doubt what she had been told. A wife taken ill in the night, a husband sending for help. It was the most ordinary of errands. Behind her, the door of the Beadle house closed. What happened next occurred in the space between the maid's departure and her return. The record does not describe it in detail, and we will not attempt to do so here. The violence, when it came, was swift and terrible. It happened in the rooms where the family had lived, in the beds where the children had slept. When it was over, William Beadle went to his study. He sat down in a Windsor chair. Beside him was a table. On the table, or near at hand, were 2 pistols. He had prepared for this moment as he had prepared for everything else, with the careful deliberation of a man who believed he was acting according to reason. He left behind his writings, pages in which he had set down his philosophy, his justifications, his explanations. He had written about fate and fortune, about the rights of a man over his own life and the lives of those who depended on him. He had written about his refusal to live in poverty, to become an object of charity or pity. He had written, in short, a testament to his own pride and despair. The maid returned with Dr. Farnsworth, or perhaps the doctor came separately. The sources do not agree on every detail. What is certain is that when the door of the Beadle house was opened, the discovery was made. Lydia Beadle was dead. The children, Ansel, Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary, were dead. William Beadle was dead in his study, seated in his chair, the instruments of his final act beside him. The maid, who had gone out on an errand of mercy, had come back to a house of the dead. News of this kind travels quickly in a small town. By the end of the day, all of Wethersfield knew what had happened in the house on the edge of town. The shock was profound. This was not a murder committed by a stranger, not a crime born of robbery or revenge. This was a father who had destroyed his own family, a husband who had killed his wife, a man who had ended his own life in a manner that defied every principle of Christian faith and common decency. The town reacted with horror and outrage. In the days that followed, William Beadle's body was treated with a contempt reserved for the worst of sinners. He was not buried in the churchyard, not laid to rest among the decent people of Wethersfield. Instead, his body was taken to an unconsecrated place by the river. The weapons he had used were bound to his corpse. He was buried without a coffin, denied even the dignity of a proper grave. The river, indifferent as always, flowed on beside him. Lydia and the children were mourned. Their deaths were lamented in sermons and in private grief. They had done nothing to deserve their fate. They had been, by all accounts, an ordinary family, living an ordinary life until the morning when everything ended. The mystery of the Beadle house was not a mystery of identity or motive. Everyone knew who had done this terrible thing, and his own writings explained, in his own words, why he believed he had the right to do it. The mystery was something else. It was the mystery of how a man could come to such a place in his mind, how pride and despair could twist together until they produced an act of such finality. It was a mystery that would trouble the conscience of the young nation for years to come. The pamphlets began to appear almost immediately. Sermons were preached. Poems were written. William Beadle became a figure of warning, a monster whose fate was meant to instruct the living. The writers of these tracts focused on his religious beliefs, his deism, his rejection of orthodox Christianity. They saw in his philosophy the seeds of his destruction. They urged their readers to hold fast to the old faith, to reject the dangerous ideas that had led a man to murder his family and take his own life. In this way, the Beadle case became something more than a local tragedy. It became a story that people told to make sense of their world, to draw lines between the acceptable and the unacceptable, the saved and the damned. But beneath the moralizing, beneath the outrage and the sermons, there remained the simple facts. A woman named Lydia, 4 children named Ansel, Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary, a house in Wethersfield, a winter morning in December, and a silence that no amount of words could fill. The maid woke to the sound of her employer's voice. It was early, earlier than the household usually stirred. December mornings in Wethersfield came slowly, the darkness holding on well past the hour when summer would have brought light through the windows. The maid had slept in her quarters, as was her custom, and now William Beadle stood at her door with instructions. Mrs. Beadle, he told her, had been ill through the night. She must go at once to fetch Dr. Joseph Farnsworth, the family physician. The errand was urgent. She should not delay. There was nothing in his manner, so far as we know, to suggest that anything was amiss beyond the illness he described. A wife unwell in winter, a husband sending for the doctor. These were ordinary troubles, the kind that visited every household sooner or later. The maid dressed and prepared to leave. Outside, the town of Wethersfield lay quiet in the December cold. The Connecticut River, which had made the town prosperous in earlier decades, flowed somewhere beyond the houses and fields, though in the darkness before dawn it would have been invisible, just a presence felt in the damp air that rose from the water. The streets, such as they were, would have been empty at that hour. Smoke from chimneys, the occasional bark of a dog, the creak of a gate in the wind. The maid set out on her errand. We do not know the exact route she took to reach Dr. Farnsworth, nor how long the journey required. Wethersfield was not a large place. A brisk walk might have carried her to the physician's door in a quarter of an hour, perhaps less. She would have passed houses much like the Beadle residence, wooden structures with shingled roofs, their windows dark or lit by the first candles of the morning. The ground beneath her feet would have been hard with frost, the air sharp in her lungs. At Dr. Farnsworth's door, she delivered her message. Mrs. Beadle was unwell. Her husband requested the doctor's attendance. What happened next is not entirely clear from the surviving accounts. Some suggest that the maid returned to the house ahead of the doctor. Others imply that she accompanied him back or that he arrived shortly after her. The precise sequence matters less than what they found when the door of the Beadle house opened again. The house was silent. This was the first wrong thing. A household with 4 children, even early in the morning, even with a mother ill in bed, should have produced some sound. The shuffle of small feet, a cough, the murmur of voices from an upper room, but there was nothing. The silence was complete, and it was the kind of silence that presses against the ears, that makes a person strain to hear something, anything that might explain it. The interior of the house would have been dim. December light, even once the sun had risen, came weakly through the small windows of a New England home. Candles would have been needed to see clearly, and perhaps no one had yet lit them. The maid or the doctor, or both together, moved through the rooms. What they found we will not describe in detail. The facts are recorded plainly enough in the documents of the time, and those who wish to know the particulars may seek them there. It is sufficient to say that Lydia Beadle and her 4 children, Ansel, Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary, were dead. They had been killed in their beds in the rooms where they had slept, by means that the household itself had provided. An axe, a carving knife. These were ordinary tools, kept for ordinary purposes, and they had been turned to an end that no one in Wethersfield could have imagined. William Beadle was also dead. He was found in his study, seated in a Windsor chair. A small table stood beside him. 2 pistols lay nearby, discharged. He had taken his own life after taking the lives of his wife and children. The scene, once discovered, could not be undiscovered. The maid, the doctor, and soon others who were summoned to the house stood in the presence of something that exceeded their understanding. 5 members of a family, and the man who had destroyed them, all within the walls of a single dwelling. The house that had been a home was now something else entirely. Word spread quickly. In a town the size of Wethersfield, news of this kind could not be contained. Neighbors came to their doors. Men who held positions of authority in the community, selectmen and justices, were informed. The minister would have been told. By midday, or perhaps sooner, the entire town knew that William Beadle, the merchant who had once been among the most prosperous of their number, had killed his family and himself. The discovery raised questions that could not easily be answered. How had this happened? Why had no one heard anything? The children, after all, had been asleep in their beds. The maid had been in the house. Yet she had heard nothing, noticed nothing, until she was awakened by Beadle himself and sent away on an errand that now seemed designed to ensure her absence. The timing was deliberate. Beadle had waited until the maid was gone, until the house was empty of witnesses before he acted. The errand to fetch Dr. Farnsworth was not a response to his wife's illness. It was a means of clearing the way. In the days that followed, as the community struggled to comprehend what had occurred, attention turned to the documents that Beadle had left behind. He had written extensively, it emerged, about his intentions and his reasons. These papers, found in his study, offered a window into a mind that had been turning toward destruction for years. 3 years, some accounts suggest. He had been planning this, or at least contemplating it, since the worst of his financial troubles began. The writings were strange, unsettling, unlike anything the people of Wethersfield had encountered. Beadle spoke of fate and providence, of the right of a man to end his own life, of his unwillingness to live in poverty after having lived well. He spoke of his children as extensions of himself, beings whose futures he had the authority to determine. He did not apologize. He did not ask for forgiveness. He explained, in terms that struck his readers as cold and reasoned, why he had done what he had done. These documents would soon be published, circulated, discussed in pamphlets and sermons throughout New England. But on that December morning they were simply papers in a dead man's study, waiting to be read. The house itself remained, the beds where the children had slept, the chair where Beadle had sat, the tools he had used, now stained and silent. These objects would be gathered, examined, and eventually disposed of. The weapons, according to some accounts, were bound to Beadle's body when he was buried. The house presumably was cleaned, though by whom and how thoroughly we do not know. What we know is that the silence the maid encountered that morning was not an absence of sound. It was the presence of something else. A stillness that had settled over the house like snow, covering everything, muffling the ordinary noises of life that should have been there. It was the silence of a family that would never speak again. And it was the silence that William Beadle had chosen for them. To understand what happened in the Beadle house, we must first understand the house itself. The residence stood in Wethersfield, a town on the Connecticut River that had been settled more than a century before the events of December 1782. By the time William Beadle and his family took up residence there, the town had established itself as a place of modest prosperity, its economy tied to the river and to the agricultural lands that surrounded it. Merchants like Beadle conducted their business through networks that extended to Boston and beyond, trading in goods that arrived by ship and were distributed throughout the region. The Beadle house was a merchant's home, which is to say it was neither grand nor humble. It would have been constructed of wood, as most New England houses were, with a central chimney providing heat to the rooms clustered around it. The layout likely followed the patterns common to the period: a keeping room or parlor on the ground floor, a kitchen, perhaps a small study or office where the master of the house conducted his business. Above, sleeping chambers for the family and somewhere in the household, quarters for the maid. The spatial arrangement of such a house created both intimacy and separation. Family members lived close together, sharing warmth and light, hearing one another's movements through thin walls and floorboards. Yet the house also contained distinct zones. The study was the domain of the husband and father. The kitchen belonged to the women of the household. The sleeping chambers, though near one another, offered at least the illusion of privacy. On the night of 10 December 1782, the family retired to their beds as they had done countless times before. Mrs. Beadle slept in the chamber she shared with her husband. The children, Ansel, Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary, slept in their own room or rooms. The maid slept in her quarters, close enough to be summoned if needed, far enough to maintain the social distance appropriate to her station. William Beadle, according to the evidence, had prepared for what he intended to do. He kept an axe by the bed. This was not unusual in itself. Many households kept tools close at hand for various purposes, and an axe might be needed to split kindling or clear ice from a doorway. But Beadle had also sharpened a carving knife, the kind used at table, and he had acquired 2 pistols. These preparations suggest forethought, a deliberate accumulation of the means to carry out his plan. The sequence of events that followed can only be reconstructed from the physical evidence and from Beadle's own writing. No witness survived to describe what happened. The maid was asleep and heard nothing. The neighbors, if there were any close enough to hear, reported no disturbance. The house kept its secrets until morning. What we can say is this: Beadle rose from his bed at some point during the night or in the early hours before dawn. He moved through the house from room to room with the tools he had prepared. He went first, it seems, to the chamber where his wife lay sleeping, then to the room where his children slept. The axe and the knife did their work. The house, which had been full of sleeping life, became a house of the dead. After the killings, Beadle returned to his study. He sat down in his Windsor chair. He placed his pistols on the table beside him, and then he ended his own life. The physical evidence, as recorded by those who discovered the scene, was consistent with this reconstruction. The bodies were found in their beds. There were no signs of struggle, no indication that anyone had awakened and tried to flee. The victims had been killed in their sleep, or so nearly asleep that they had no chance to resist or cry out. This raises questions that the people of Wethersfield must have asked themselves in the days that followed. How was it possible that no one heard anything? An axe striking flesh and bone is not a silent act. A knife drawn across a throat might be quieter, but surely there would have been some sound, some cry, some movement that would have alerted the others in the house. The answers, such as they are, lie in the nature of the house and the nature of sleep. The rooms were separate. The walls, though thin by modern standards, would have muffled sounds from one chamber to another. The maid in her quarters was perhaps too far away to hear what happened in the family's sleeping chambers. And the victims themselves, if they were struck while deeply asleep, might have had no opportunity to make any sound at all. There is also the question of the maid's absence in the morning. Beadle woke her early and sent her to fetch the doctor. This errand removed the only potential witness from the house, giving Beadle time to complete his plan before anyone could intervene. Whether the killings had already occurred by the time he woke the maid, or whether he carried them out after she left, we cannot say with certainty. The accounts suggest that Mrs. Beadle was said to have been ill during the night, which implies that Beadle spoke to the maid as though his wife were still alive. If this is true, then the murders took place after the maid departed, in the brief window of time before she returned with the doctor. But other readings are possible. Beadle might have killed his family during the night and then waited until morning to send the maid away, using the time to compose himself and prepare for his own death. The claim that Mrs. Beadle had been ill might have been a fabrication, designed to explain why the maid should leave, and why she should not look in on her mistress before going. The physical layout of the house would have facilitated either sequence. The study, where Beadle ultimately died, was separate from the sleeping chambers. He could have moved from room to room without passing through the maid's quarters, and he could have returned to his study to await the moment of his own death without being observed. Contemporary observers, when they examined the scene, focused less on these spatial questions than on the moral and religious implications of what had occurred. The presence of Beadle's writings, with their strange arguments about fate and the rights of a father over his children, dominated the discussion. The physical evidence was noted, catalogued, and then set aside in favor of theological interpretation. Yet the spatial logic of the crime remains significant. It tells us something about how Beadle conceived of his act. He moved through his own house, the house where he had lived with his family for nearly a decade, and he transformed each room in turn. The bedroom became a place of death. The children's chamber became a place of death. The study where he had written his letters and managed his accounts became the place where he ended his own life. The house, in other words, was not merely the setting for the crime. It was the instrument of the crime. Its layout, its separations, its silences, all contributed to the possibility of what Beadle did. A different house with different arrangements might have made the act impossible. A house where the maid slept closer to the family. A house where the children's room was adjacent to the parents' chamber. A house where sound carried more easily from room to room. But the Beadle house was what it was. And in the early hours of 11 December 1782, it became the site of something that the people of Wethersfield had never seen before. Competing theories about Beadle's motives emerged almost immediately. Some observers, particularly the clergy who preached and published in the aftermath, attributed his actions to his religious beliefs. Beadle, they said, was a deist, a man who had rejected the orthodox Christianity of his neighbors in favor of a cold and rational philosophy that denied the authority of Scripture and the reality of divine judgment. This philosophy, they argued, had led him to believe that he had the right to dispose of his own life and the lives of his children as he saw fit. Others emphasized the economic dimension. Beadle had been ruined by the collapse of continental currency. He had obeyed the law, accepting the paper money at face value even as it depreciated to worthlessness, while other merchants had quietly raised their prices or refused the bad currency altogether. His adherence to the legal and patriotic requirements of the revolutionary cause had destroyed him financially, and he could not bear the prospect of living in poverty after having lived well. Still others saw the crime as an act of pride. Beadle, in his own writings, spoke of himself as a man above the common mold, someone who could not endure the humiliation of dependence or the pity of his neighbors. He had been a man of standing, a contributor to the relief of Boston when the port was closed, a merchant whose word was trusted. To fall from that position to become an object of charity was intolerable to him. These interpretations are not mutually exclusive. Economic ruin, wounded pride, and heterodox belief may all have contributed to Beadle's state of mind in the years and months before the crime. His writings suggest a man who had been brooding on his situation for a long time, turning it over in his mind, constructing arguments that justified what he intended to do. But the writings also raise questions of their own. Were they the product of a rational mind, as Beadle himself seemed to believe? Or were they the symptoms of a disordered intellect, a man whose reason had been corrupted by despair? The people of Wethersfield and the pamphleteers and ministers who commented on the case tended toward the latter view. They called Beadle a monster, a man whose rejection of true religion had led him into madness and crime. Yet Beadle's arguments, however disturbing, followed a certain logic. He believed that he had the right to end his own life. He believed that his children, as extensions of himself, were subject to his authority even in death. He believed that poverty and dependence were fates worse than death, and that by killing his family he was sparing them from those fates. These beliefs were wrong. They were, by the standards of his time and hours, monstrous, but they were not incoherent. They formed a system, a way of thinking about the world that, once accepted, led inexorably to the conclusion that Beadle reached. Cozy crime does not solve mysteries, it contemplates them. And the mystery at the heart of the Beadle case is not who committed the crime, or how, but why. Why did a man who had been prosperous, respected, and by all accounts a loving father come to believe that the destruction of his family was not only permissible but necessary? The answers lie somewhere in the intersection of economics, religion, pride, and the particular circumstances of revolutionary America. They lie. There was no investigation in the manner we might now expect. No detective arrived at the Beadle house on that December morning in 1782, notebook in hand, ready to piece together a sequence of events. The very concept of a detective as a professional role belonged to a future not yet imagined. What arrived instead was something older and more communal. the gathering of neighbors, the summoning of local men of standing, the slow assembly of a town trying to comprehend what had happened within its borders. In Wethersfield, Connecticut, authority in such matters rested with selectmen, justices of the peace, and whatever coroner or medical man could be called upon. Dr. Joseph Farnsworth, the family physician whom the maid had been sent to fetch that morning, would have been among the first to enter the house and observe what lay within. The town's leading citizens followed. There was no forensic science to speak of, no fingerprinting, no chemical analysis. There was only the evidence of eyes and the testimony of those who had known the household. The scene itself told its story plainly enough. William Beadle was found in his study, seated in a Windsor chair, 2 discharged pistols nearby. His wife Lydia and their 4 children lay elsewhere in the house, victims of an attack that had occurred while they slept or shortly after waking. An axe and a carving knife, both belonging to the household, were present. The maid, having been sent away on an errand before dawn, had not witnessed what happened. She could only report that her master had awakened her early, told her that Mrs. Beadle had been ill during the night, and instructed her to fetch the doctor. There were no suspects to consider, no alternative theories to weigh. The physical evidence pointed in one direction only. William Beadle had killed his family and then taken his own life. The question of who was responsible admitted no uncertainty. The mystery, such as it was, lay entirely in the realm of why. The authorities of Wethersfield did not need to conduct interviews or pursue leads. They needed only to confirm what was already apparent and to determine what should be done with the remains. In this, they moved with a certainty that reflected the moral clarity of their moment. Beadle had committed an act that placed him beyond the pale of ordinary human sympathy. He had destroyed his wife and children. He had taken his own life. And he had done so, as his own writings would soon reveal, according to a philosophy that the community found abhorrent. The writings themselves became central to the community's understanding of the event. Beadle had left behind papers, a kind of testament or manifesto, in which he set out his reasoning. These documents were discovered in the house and quickly became the subject of intense scrutiny. They revealed a man who had contemplated this act for years, who had developed an elaborate justification for it, and who believed himself to be acting in accordance with reason and natural law. In these papers, Beadle explained that he could not bear the prospect of poverty. He had once been prosperous, respected, a merchant of standing in his community. The collapse of continental currency had stripped him of his fortune. He had obeyed the law, accepting the depreciating paper money at face value, when other merchants quietly raised their prices or found ways to evade the regulations. His patriotism and his honesty, as he saw it, had been rewarded with ruin. He wrote that he had been formed by nature to live well, that he was above the common mold of men, and that he could not endure the humiliation of dependence. To become a burden, to be seen as a failure, to watch his children grow up in poverty after having known comfort. These possibilities were intolerable to him. He believed that he had the right to end his own life, and that in doing so, he had the right to take his children with him, sparing them from a future he could not bear to imagine. The religious and philosophical dimensions of these writings horrified the clergy and moralists who read them. Beadle expressed views that his contemporaries identified as deism, a belief system that acknowledged a creator, but rejected the doctrines of revealed religion, the authority of Scripture, and the promise of divine intervention in human affairs. He seemed to believe that the universe operated according to fixed laws, that fate or providence had determined his course, and that his actions were consistent with reason rather than contrary to it. This was not the thinking of a man who had lost his mind in a moment of desperation. It was the thinking of a man who had constructed, over years, a framework that permitted him to do what he did. The community found this more disturbing, not less. A sudden madness might be pitied. A deliberate philosophy that led to the destruction of innocence could only be condemned. the response of Wethersfield was swift and unambiguous. Beadle's body was denied the ordinary rites of burial. He was not laid to rest in the town cemetery alongside respectable citizens. Instead, his remains were taken to an unconsecrated place by the river. The murder weapons, the axe and the knife, were bound to his corpse. He was buried without a coffin, a final mark of the community's rejection. This treatment was not merely punitive. It was symbolic, a way of declaring that William Beadle had placed himself outside the boundaries of the community he had once belonged to. In death, as in his final act, he was to be set apart. The river location proved unfortunate. Erosion eventually disturbed the grave, exposing the remains, and Beadle's body was reportedly reburied more than once. Even in death, he would not stay settled. Lydia Beadle and the children, Ansel, Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary, received different treatment. They were victims, not perpetrators. The community's sympathy, such as it was, extended to them. Yet the records consulted for this account do not clearly specify where they were laid to rest. Their burial places have faded from the documented record, a quiet disappearance that speaks to the way tragedy can erase as well as preserve. The absence of a trial meant that there was no formal legal proceeding to establish facts, hear testimony, or render judgment. Beadle had served as his own judge and executioner. The community could only respond after the fact, through burial practices, through the circulation of his writings, and through the sermons and pamphlets that would soon follow. In the weeks and months after December 1782, the Beadle case became a subject of intense public discussion throughout New England. Printers produced pamphlets that reproduced portions of his writings alongside condemnations from clergy. Poets composed verses warning readers to detest the errors that had led to such an outcome. Ministers preached sermons using Beadle as an example of what happened when a man abandoned true religion for the cold abstractions of deism. The tone of these publications was uniformly condemnatory. Beadle was called a monster. His philosophy was described as dangerous, his reasoning as a perversion of the rational faculties that God had given to man. The pamphlets urged readers to hold fast to orthodox Christian belief, to reject the seductions of natural religion, and to recognize that Beadle's fate was the logical endpoint of his errors. There is something instructive in this response. The community did not treat Beadle as simply mad or simply evil. They treated him as a cautionary example, a man whose ideas had led him astray. The emphasis on his deism, on his philosophical writings, on his rejection of revealed religion, suggests that the community saw the case as a battle of ideas. Beadle had believed certain things, and those beliefs had produced certain actions. To prevent such actions in the future, the beliefs themselves had to be refuted. This framing served multiple purposes. It allowed the community to make sense of an otherwise incomprehensible act. It provided a moral lesson that could be taught and repeated. And it reinforced the authority of the established religious order at a moment when that order faced challenges from Enlightenment thinking and the upheavals of revolution. Yet the framing also obscured other dimensions of the case. The economic context, the collapse of currency, the ruin of a man who had tried to do the right thing by accepting legal tender at face value, received less attention in the moralizing literature than the religious questions. Beadle's writings made clear that his financial losses were central to his despair, but the pamphlets and sermons preferred to focus on his theology. Perhaps this was because the economic critique was too uncomfortable. If Beadle's ruin had been caused in part by the policies of the Continental Congress and the Connecticut legislature, if his patriotic compliance with legal tender laws had contributed to his downfall, then the community itself bore some share of responsibility. It was easier to blame his deism than to examine the systems that had destroyed him. The investigation, such as it was, concluded with the community's judgment, rendered in burial practices and printed condemnation. There would be no further proceedings, no appeals, no new evidence to consider. The case was closed on the day it was discovered. What remained was the task of interpretation, of deciding what the Beadle tragedy meant and what lessons it held for the living. The news from Wethersfield travelled outward in the manner of the age, carried by post riders and reprinted in newspapers, discussed in taverns and meeting houses, passed from town to town along the roads of New England. By the standards of 1782, the Beadle case became something close to a sensation. It was not merely a local tragedy. It was an event that demanded explanation, that seemed to speak to larger questions about the state of the new nation and the souls of its citizens. December 1782 was a peculiar moment in American history. The Revolutionary War was not yet formally concluded, though the major fighting had ended more than a year earlier with the British surrender at Yorktown in October 1781. Peace negotiations were underway in Paris, but the treaty would not be signed until the following September. The country existed in a kind of suspended state, no longer at war in any practical sense, but not yet officially at peace. The economic disruptions of the war years had not resolved themselves. Continental currency, the paper money issued by the Continental Congress to finance the revolution, had collapsed in value so completely that the phrase, "not worth a continental," had entered the language as a synonym for worthlessness. Merchants who had accepted this currency at face value, as the law required, had watched their savings evaporate. Those who had found ways around the regulations, raising prices or insisting on hard money, had fared better. The result was a profound sense of unfairness, a feeling that virtue had been punished and cunning rewarded. William Beadle had been among the virtuous, or so he believed. He had accepted the continental dollars. He had obeyed the law. He had supported the patriot cause, contributing to the relief of Boston when the port was closed by Parliament. And he had been ruined. His case was not unique. Thousands of Americans had suffered similar losses. But Beadle's response to his ruin was singular, and it was this response that captured the attention of his contemporaries. The pamphlets that circulated in the weeks after the murders framed the case primarily as a religious warning. Beadle's deism, his rejection of orthodox Christianity, his belief in a distant God who did not intervene in human affairs, these were presented as the root causes of his crime. The message was clear: abandon true religion, embrace the cold philosophy of the Enlightenment, and this is where you end. The pamphlets quoted from Beadle's own writings, holding up his words as evidence of the dangers of unbelief. This framing resonated with a public that was already anxious about the moral state of the new nation. The revolution had been justified in part by appeals to natural rights and rational principles, language that drew on Enlightenment philosophy. But many Americans worried that these ideas, taken too far, could undermine the religious foundations of society. The Beadle case seemed to confirm their fears. Here was a man who had reasoned his way to murder, who had used the language of rights and nature to justify the destruction of his own family. The clergy seized on the case with particular energy. Sermons were preached throughout New England using Beadle as a text. Ministers warned their congregations to hold fast to the faith of their fathers, to reject the seductions of deism and natural religion, to recognize that human reason, unaided by divine revelation, could lead only to error and destruction. The Beadle case became a weapon in the ongoing struggle between Orthodox Christianity and the various forms of religious liberalism that were gaining ground in the late 18th century. Poets contributed their own responses. Verses circulated that described Beadle as a monster, that urged readers to detest his errors, that presented his fate as a lesson in the wages of sin. These poems were not subtle. They were didactic, moralistic, designed to reinforce the message of the sermons and pamphlets. They treated the deaths of Lydia and the children as a tragedy, but a tragedy with a clear moral. The father's philosophy had killed them. The press coverage, to the extent that the term applies to the newspapers of 1782, followed a similar pattern. Reports of the murders appeared in papers throughout New England and beyond, often accompanied by editorial commentary that emphasized the religious dimensions of the case. The tone was uniformly condemnatory. There was no sympathy for Beadle, no attempt to understand his desperation, no acknowledgement that the economic system might bear some responsibility for his ruin. He was a monster, and monsters were to be denounced. Yet beneath the moralizing, other currents were visible. Some of the commentary acknowledged, if only in passing, that Beadle had been a respectable man before his fall. He had been prosperous, well-regarded, a contributor to patriotic causes. His descent into financial ruin and philosophical error was presented as a cautionary tale, but the tale only worked if readers understood that Beadle had once been one of them. The monster had been a neighbor. This recognition carried its own anxieties. If Beadle could fall, who else might follow? The economic instability of the post-war period meant that many families faced uncertain futures. The collapse of currency had not spared the virtuous. The war had disrupted trade, displaced populations, and left debts that could not easily be repaid. In this context, the Beadle case was not merely a story about one man's madness or one man's heresy. It was a story about the fragility of prosperity and the terror of decline. The public reaction also revealed something about the way communities processed violence in this period. There was no police investigation to follow, no trial to attend, no verdict to debate. The community's response was moral and symbolic rather than legal and procedural. The denial of proper burial, the binding of weapons to the corpse, the sermons and pamphlets. These were the mechanisms by which Wethersfield and the broader region made sense of what had happened and reasserted their values. The treatment of Beadle's body was particularly significant. In an age when burial practices carried deep meaning, the decision to inter him without a coffin in unconsecrated ground, with the instruments of his crime bound to him, was a powerful statement. It declared that Beadle had forfeited his place in the community of the living and the dead. He was not to be mourned, he was not to be remembered with honor. He was to be set apart, marked as other, expelled even in death. The competing events of 1782 and 1783 provide context for the attention the case received. The peace negotiations in Paris were the dominant political story, but they unfolded slowly and at a great distance. Closer to home, Americans were grappling with the practical challenges of building a new nation, establishing governments, settling debts, defining the relationship between states and the nascent federal authority. The Beadle case offered a different kind of story, one that was immediate, local, and viscerally comprehensible. It was a story about a family, a house, a single night. It could be told and retold, moralized and interpreted, in ways that the abstractions of diplomacy and statecraft could not. The case also contributed to ongoing debates about the nature of the American character. Was the new nation to be a Christian republic, grounded in the faith and morals of its Puritan and Protestant heritage? Or was it to be something more secular, guided by reason and natural law, open to the Enlightenment currents that had helped inspire the Revolution? The Beadle case became evidence in this debate, cited by those who feared that the latter path led to destruction. Later historians would note that the Beadle case is often described as the first clearly documented mass murder and suicide in North American history. This distinction, if accurate, helps explain the intensity of the contemporary response. The community was confronting something new, or at least something newly visible. There was no established framework for understanding such an event, no precedent to guide the response. The pamphlets and sermons were attempts to create that framework, to fit the Beadle case into a moral and religious narrative that made sense of the senseless. The emphasis on Beadle's writings was central to this project. By focusing on his philosophy, his deism, his rejection of orthodox belief, the commentators could present the case as a story with a clear cause and a clear lesson. The writings provided evidence of premeditation. of a mind that had reasoned its way to an abominable conclusion. They allowed the community to say, "This is what happens when you think like this." Yet the writings also complicated the narrative. Beadle had not acted in a moment of passion or madness. He had planned, prepared, and justified his actions over years. He had believed himself to be acting rationally, even virtuously. This was disturbing in a way that simple insanity would not have been. It suggested that reason itself could be dangerous, that the faculties prized by the Enlightenment could lead a man astray. The response to the Beadle case, then, was not merely a response to a crime. It was a response to an idea, a philosophy, a way of thinking about the world. The community rejected Beadle's philosophy with a force that went beyond ordinary grief or outrage. They rejected it in stone and earth, in the manner of his burial, in the words they chose to print and preach. They rejected it because to accept even a portion of his reasoning would have been to admit that their own world, built on reason and virtue and the promise of the new republic, contained within it the seeds of such destruction. And so we come, at last, to the matter of what remains. What traces persist in the world when the pamphlets have yellowed and the sermons have faded from memory? What the land itself remembers, if land can be said to remember anything at all. Wethersfield still stands. It is among the oldest towns in Connecticut, and it wears its age with quiet dignity. The streets that William Beadle once walked are in many cases the same streets that visitors walk today. The town has preserved much of its colonial character, and the historic district contains houses that would have been familiar to the Beadle family, structures of wood and brick that have weathered more than 2 centuries of New England seasons. The exact fate of the Beadle house itself is less certain. The archival record does not clearly state whether the building survived into the modern era or was demolished at some point in the intervening years. What is known is that the town did not choose to memorialize the site. There is no plaque, no marker, no indication to the casual visitor that anything of note occurred there. The absence is itself a kind of statement, a continuation of the community's original rejection. The Connecticut Historical Society holds materials relating to the case. Pamphlets printed in the months and years following December 1782 are preserved there, their pages fragile but legible. The sermons of ministers who used Beadle as a warning against irreligion and pride survive in these collections. The poems composed to instruct and to mourn can still be read by those who seek them out. These documents form a kind of paper monument, more durable in some ways than stone. The burial of William Beadle was, as we have heard, a deliberate act of exclusion. His body was placed in unconsecrated ground by the river, without coffin or ceremony. The murder weapons were bound to his corpse. This was not mere practicality, but ritual, a way of marking him as outside the community of the faithful, outside the company of ordinary dead. The river, in time, disturbed this grave. Erosion exposed what had been buried. The remains were reinterred, though the precise location of this second burial is not recorded with certainty. Lydia Beadle and the children, Ansel, Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary, were treated differently. They were victims, and the community understood them as such. Yet the archival record is strangely silent on the particulars of their burial. Where they were laid to rest, whether in the town cemetery or in some quieter corner, is not clearly documented in the sources that have come down to us. This silence is not unusual for the era. Women and children often pass through the historical record with less notice than men, their lives and deaths marked only in family Bibles or church registers that have since been lost. What we can say is that the Beadle family as a household ceased to exist on the morning of 11 December 1782. The line ended. The domestic world that Lydia had managed, the future that the children might have known, the ordinary continuity of generations, all of it was severed in a single morning's violence. The case has not been forgotten by historians. It appears in scholarly articles and regional histories, examined for what it reveals about the anxieties of the Revolutionary era. The collapse of continental currency, the strain placed upon merchants who tried to obey the law, the fear of poverty among those who had known prosperity, these themes recur in the academic literature. Beadle's writings, with their strange mixture of reason and horror, continue to attract attention from those who study the intellectual history of early America. Some scholars emphasize the economic dimension. They point to the currency crisis, to the impossible position in which Beadle found himself, accepting paper money at face value while watching his fortune drain away. They note that other merchants quietly evaded the regulations, raising prices or refusing bad paper, and that Beadle's insistence on lawful compliance was, in its way, a form of self-destruction long before he lifted the axe. Other scholars focus on the religious and philosophical aspects. They examine Beadle's deism, his belief that God had set the world in motion and then stepped back, that fate governed human affairs, that a man had the right to dispose of his own life and the lives of those dependent upon him. These ideas were not unique to Beadle. They circulated in the intellectual currents of the 18th century, debated in coffee houses and pamphlets. But Beadle took them to a conclusion that horrified his contemporaries, and the clergy used his example to warn against the dangers of straying from orthodox faith. The truth, as is often the case, likely lies in some combination of these factors. Economic ruin and philosophical conviction, wounded pride and genuine despair, the pressure of circumstances, and the particular workings of one man's mind. The archival record preserves the facts but cannot fully explain the interior world that produced them. What the case reveals most clearly, perhaps, is the fragility of the structures we build to hold our lives together. Beadle had been a respected merchant, a contributor to patriotic causes, a man with a wife and children, and a place in his community. The war and its economic dislocations stripped away his fortune. His philosophy, meant perhaps to comfort him, instead provided a framework for destruction. The community that had once welcomed him turned, after his death, to rituals of exclusion and condemnation. There is a temptation, when examining such cases, to search for a single cause, a clear explanation that will make sense of the senseless. The record resists this temptation. Beadle's writings show a man who believed himself to be acting rationally, even virtuously. His neighbors saw a monster. Both perspectives are preserved in the archive, and neither fully accounts for the other. The children, Ansel, Elizabeth, Lydia, and Mary, remain the most difficult aspect of the case to contemplate. They were young. The eldest, Ansel, was about 11. The youngest, Mary, was perhaps 6. They had no part in their father's financial troubles or philosophical speculation. They were, by all accounts, ordinary children of an ordinary merchant household, their days filled with the small routines of domestic life in a Connecticut river town. They did not choose their fate, and the record does not preserve their voices. Lydia Beadle, too, is largely silent in the archive. She appears as a wife and mother, as a woman who had been away from home and returned earlier than expected, as someone who was reportedly unwell on the night before her death. Beyond these bare facts, we know little of her thoughts, her hopes, her understanding of her husband's state of mind. She may have sensed something amiss. She may have lived in ignorance of the plans taking shape in his study. The sources do not tell us. What we can do, across the distance of more than 2 centuries, is acknowledge that they lived. Lydia and Ansel and Elizabeth and Lydia and Mary were not abstractions or symbols. They were people who breathed the air of a December morning, who slept in beds in a house in Wethersfield, who had no reason to expect that the day would be anything other than ordinary. The violence that ended their lives was not their doing, and the moral lessons that preachers drew from their deaths were not of their choosing. The town of Wethersfield has continued. The river still flows. The houses of the historic district stand beneath trees that have grown and been replaced many times over. Visitors come to see the old architecture, the quiet streets, the sense of a place that has persisted through the centuries. Most of them do not know the story of the Beadle family. The town does not advertise it, and perhaps that is as it should be. The case was, for the community of 1782, a wound that required careful treatment. They buried Beadle outside the bounds of ordinary memory. They honored his victims as best they could. They wrote their sermons and their poems, drew their moral lessons, and then gradually allowed the matter to recede into the past. The archive preserves what the community chose to record. The silences preserve what they chose to forget, or what was never written down in the first place. Between the two, we find the outline of a story, incomplete but real, a glimpse of lives that were lived and ended in a small town during the uncertain years of a new nation. Tonight, as you rest, you might imagine Wethersfield as it is now. The old houses standing in the darkness, their windows reflecting the quiet of a winter evening. The river moving slowly toward the sea, the streets empty and still, the air cold and clear. Somewhere in the town, in a library or a historical society, the old pamphlets sleep in their folders, the ink faded but legible, the words waiting for the next reader who will seek them out. The past is never entirely. It lingers in documents and buildings, in the shape of streets and the names of places. It lingers too in the act of remembering, in the choice to speak of those who came before and to acknowledge that their lives mattered. Lydia Beadle and her children did not ask to be remembered in this way. They would have preferred, surely, to live out their ordinary lives, to see the seasons turn, to grow old in the company of family and neighbors. That future was taken. What remains is the record, partial and imperfect, and the willingness of those who come after to hold their memory gently. The night is quiet now. The story has been told. The archive closes, the candle dims, and the town of Wethersfield rests beneath the winter stars, as it has rested for more than 200 years. In closing, the old streets of Wethersfield lie still beneath the December sky, the river winding past as it did in 1782, the houses of the historic district keeping their long watch. A single light glows in a window, then fades, and the town settles into the deep quiet of a winter night. To remember Lydia, Ansel, Elizabeth, Lydia and Mary is to insist that their lives held weight and meaning, even when the record falls silent. Thank you for listening, for resting here with us through this long evening. Whenever you wish, you are welcome to return. Rest well. A peaceful night to you.